Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to TIU Global Dialogue. Sorry for keep you waiting. This is our first time to have a global dialogue session in this room on this campus. So sorry for being delayed a little bit, and thank you for your patience. My name is Akitoshi Miyashita. I'm a vice president and the dean of the School of International Relations, also the Retract program. Today, the topic is riding the waves and battling the current, foreign policy under the Kishida administration. And we have a great speaker today. I am really pleased and honored to have Brad Glosserman. I would like to introduce him to you. Brad is a deputy director and visiting professor at the Center for Rulemaking Strategies at Tama University. He's also a senior advisor at the Pacific Forum, Hawaii-based think tank. And he has written many books, including, I think, most recent one, Peak Japan, End of Great Ambition, from Georgetown University Press. And in 2015, he co-authored a book with Scott Snyder, Japan, South Korea, Identity Crisis. Professor Glosserman is an expert on U.S. policy for Asia Pacific, security issues in Asia, and the Japanese domestic and foreign policy. Before we start, I would like to talk a little bit about the procedures for today. Professor Glosserman will talk about 30 minutes on this topic. Could be longer, but and then we open the floor for Q&A. But I may go ahead and ask a few questions as a moderator, but you're welcome to raise any questions after you hear from him. Please tell who you are and your affiliation. If you're TIU students, which major, what year you're in, things like that. And I know some of you are listening or watching this on Zoom. If you have any questions, please send your question to the chat room, and we will announce your questions later on the Q&A session. So, without further ado, let me welcome Professor Brad Glosserman.
Very kind. It's very nice to be here. Thanks for taking. I was going to say taking time out of your day, but I presume this is a class. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you. It's also, a special thanks go to Jeff Daniel, professor who roped me into this gig, and is one of my former fellows. And TIU is really lucky to have him. He's becoming, I think, one of the experts on Southeast Asian and maritime security issues, particularly those that involve the Philippines. And I've been working with him on a number of projects. He's been doing all the work, and I can get some of the credit for all of that hard work. And he's just a great asset. We got so lucky to have him. I hope he's good in his classes with his administrator. As you said, did I come up with the topic of the title of the speech?
Yep, you did.
Oh, journalism teaches you the headlines are important. So I was wondering why it sounded like such a great speech. I'll try to give you a sense of why I decided to use that. But there's a lot of ground cover. And what I think, ideally the way I like to do these speeches, which never quite works out, is I try to just sort of give you the headlines and then try to speak fairly briefly, and the issues that are more interesting to you can tease out in the discussion. And that way this conversation is of interest to you and rather what is of interest to me. And to that end, by the way, I'm being fairly calm, quiet now, but I tend to get excited as I talk. I can get colloquial, I can get excited, And so if there's something that I say that isn't clear, either my accent isn't clear, my reasoning isn't clear, or the background isn't, just interrupt me and let me know, and I'll try to clarify that. A lot of the remarks that I'm going to give you are taken from a book that I've just signed a contract for that's going to be coming out next year on the Abe foreign policy legacy. I've written it with Gil Rosman, who's a retired sociologist at Princeton University and a very good friend of mine. And Gil and I sort of split the writing on this book. It'll come out, I'm hoping, early in 2024 from Rutledge, I think Rutledge Asia. But it looks at the legacy of Abe's 10 years, and as well as the foreign policy that followed it during the Suga and Kishida administrations. So I urge you all to buy that book. I have a young son, that will be his college fund. Royalty is very important. So put it on your reading list, etc. So, well, I mean, you know, the idea of the momentum is and the countercurrents are in my big sweep. Let me stand up. I always find it easier to walk around here. In the larger sweep of Japanese foreign policy, what you really got, I think, as we look at the Kishida administration, is a administration and a prime minister that's largely riding waves and following the momentum of the foreign policy that was set in motion probably since 2013 when Abe came to office. And I'll make that case as I go on. The countercurrents are, I think, the degree to which Kishida, as a prime minister, as an individual, believes, or as the case in my take is, and while I think I'm right, I always think I'm right. These are my opinions. I'm prepared to be challenged, but I will push back, challenge. I think that this is a man who doesn't believe in a great deal, and therefore has to deal with the countercurrents in a lot of foreign policy and institutions of Japanese bureaucracy and Japanese society that are countervailing forces. And thus, that's, you know, he's riding the waves and he's battling these countercurrents. And that's, I think, really how we can explain what Mr. Kishida is trying to accomplish. I divided my talk really, or this conversation, really into two parts. The first would be the domestic factors that are facing, that are sort of shaping and influencing his policies. And the second are the external ones. And I think you can cut and slice this almost any way you want. For me, this makes a lot of sense, but we can go at it different ways, but you'll live with this one for today. So my first point would be when it comes to prime ministerial preferences. And that would be, you know, what is the prime minister himself believe in? And in the conversations that I've had with foreign policy officials, people that were sort of informal advisors to the cabinet that have known both the prime minister and other ranking members of the LDP, the short answer was, it really isn't clear what the prime minister believes in other than doing what he can to support his home constituency, which is Hiroshima. And so that's why, for example, the G7 meeting was held here. I mean, of course, he used that as a backdrop to push his disarmament agenda, his anti-nuclear agenda. But that, again, reflects, you know, his home constituency. Beyond that, he talks a big game. We can discuss that in the context, for example, of his new capitalism, you know, rhetoric. But it's really hard to see what he believes in, what these things mean beyond the general abstractions and the appeal, if you will, to some of the instincts of the social democratic Japan. But there's no push, there's no real commitment internally to making things happen, to make hard choices that would demonstrate, you know, a readiness to use political capital. And as I said, would demonstrate as well something that this is a guy, something he wants to fight. And there just hasn't been much of that thus far in his nearly what year and change in office. At the same time, one of the things I think that he's truly committed to is managing the various fissures and fractions and factions within the LDP, and therefore staying in power. And I think what we've seen in the maneuvers in the last couple of weeks in particular is really prove that what he's trying to do more than anything else is to break the will, if you will, the reversion to the trend of the one-year prime ministers that, you know, marked Japan throughout after the Koizumi era, during the 1990s, and then the interregnum 2006 to 2012, 2013, when you literally had a prime minister every year. He wants to get beyond that. You saw Abe set the record for the longest serving prime minister by virtue of an extraordinary skill set. And I say that with admiration, but the truth of the matter is I'm very ambivalent about Prime Minister Abe for a bunch of people. But at the same time, so what he wants to do, Kishida is trying to do, is manage a very fractious party, one that he's floating above, one which he plays the role of what has been the traditional role of the prime minister, which is someone who listens to everyone. And that's what, again, speaks to this sort of indifference to what the prime minister believes in. He listens to everyone, tries to internalize it, tries to make sure that everyone's happy, and makes a decision that essentially alienates no one and allows him to stay in power. But it's tough because the party itself is fairly well divided and actually facing some pretty tough issues that were discussed during the course of the afternoon that require tough choices and which he just doesn't seem quite ready to take. And at the same time, to the degree that we can look at Kishida, look at his history, look at what he believes, and the general impression of him prior to taking office is that he was considered to be part of the liberal, progressive, maybe center-left part of the party. And in fact, Jacinto has moved to the right for the last 10 years under the stewardship of Prime Minister Abe. And thus, you've seen greater attention to, greater support for very traditional conservative causes within the LDP. And thus, that's one of the countercurrents. A prime minister that probably would prefer to see policies, foreign policy in particular, that are perhaps a little bit more to the center and to the left, and in fact is fighting both the momentum, the bureaucratic momentum established by his predecessors, that is a little bit more conservative, and then as well, just an external environment that is increasingly hostile or certainly more difficult to navigate. And that's the set of factors we consider in the second half of the speech. So my second big point then is, what is the Abe legacy? I mean, apart from being the longest serving prime minister in Japanese history, it's pretty straightforward. He is a conservative. He is a nationalist. He moves the party and the country to the right. At the same time, what is quite remarkable about Prime Minister Abe was his pragmatism. If you haven't read Tobias Harris's book on Abe, I highly, highly recommend that you read it. It's a wonderful vision. And I find that, again, I'm very ambivalent about the Prime Minister. He was extremely successful as evidenced in his longevity. But at the same time, I think that he read or facilitated or nurtured, if you will, a certain cynicism in Japanese politics and alienated a great number of young people in particular by virtue of his politicking and his political style. At the same time, however, he wasn't, this time in office, he wasn't, unlike his first term in office back in 2006 and 2007, this was a man who demonstrated great pragmatism. He was capable of tacking back towards the center with his particular policy preferences. This nationalist conservative side would perhaps take him out of the mainstream. And when there was too much pushback from the Japanese public, or events just got somewhat out of hand, if you will, he was capable of making the shift back to the center to regain political control, to regain, to recapture their momentum. That's something he didn't do in his first term in office. He also got better medicine that sort of managed some of his health problems. What else did Abe's legacy? He was a great skeptic about China. That reflected, I think, a certain question, the nature of his worldview, the traditional competition within Japan has with China, a certain reckoning with his history, and that was manifested as well, most particularly in the things that I like to talk about, or the things that I do work on. For example, his readiness to talk about Taiwan, the centrality or the importance of Taiwan to Japanese foreign policy, which was something that, quite frankly, had always been discussed quietly behind closed doors among politicians, bureaucrats, and international conversations, but was never part of the public conversation. It was felt it was too sensitive a subject, something that the public would not support and understand that the implications of acknowledging Taiwan's significance to Japanese national security and national interests were acknowledged. Third, generally speaking, as a conservative, he believed that Japan was a great country and had a role to play. He believed in a higher international profile. Japan should be more prominent. It was just at the end of it, well, it was the third largest economy in the world, having just been eclipsed by China in 2010, from number 2. But it was a country that had benefited so much from the international system, that had played such a prominent role, that had such a distinguished history, until, of course, the hijacking of the imperial regime by the military, and, if you will, the Great Meiji Restoration went off the rails. That until that point, Japan needed once again to assume an international role, to be engaged internationally in ways that were commensurate with its economic standing which also meant, I think, of necessity, a changing of the way that it thought about international security and what it would do to address particularly hard security affairs. And what that meant essentially, this was always part of this dream to revise Article 9 to allow Japan to play a larger role in international military and international security affairs. Which is my fourth point. Fifth, as part of that package, he recommitted to the US alliance. Now, there was some talk during the years of the DPJ, and certainly from the years of 2000 on, when at one point when Japan was seen as being more powerful and more ascendant, that maybe as Asia was rising, that there was a way to rethink international relations, that maybe it was time that Japan put a little more distance between itself and the United States. And I think Abe recognized that that was a silly idea, and that in fact, Japan's best future lie in an increasingly integrated relationship with the United States, one that strengthened the ties between the two countries on so many different levels. And that meant that Japan was going to have to make internal changes as well if it was going to address the expectations that the United States had of its most important security partner. And then finally, for all of that commitment to the United States, there was the acknowledgement that the world was changing, the United States was changing, evidence, of course, in the arrival of Donald Trump, but also even predating that, insofar as there were doubts, for example, about President Obama's periodic commitment to the relationship with the United States. And if you want to go into it, we can talk about the way in which Obama was prepared, or the way that any US president is prepared to engage China, raises doubts in places in Nagasacho and Kasumigaseki, where maybe the doubts begin to be, or questions are raised and doubts begin to bubble up about the nature of the US commitment. Will the US instead find a new partner in China rather than because it's the biggest power, it's the one with which Beijing and Washington make decisions to get things done, and then maybe Tokyo will be eclipsed as the apple of the American eye, so to speak. So in that world, Japan has got to branch out and build new relations. So when you saw it getting closer ties with Australia, with Europe, going deeper into Southeast Asia, building ties particularly with India, which has continued. All of those have continued, but they were seen in some ways as a hedge against prospect of American abandonment. And at the same time, if you will, a way to thicken the underbrush of international multilateral engagement in the region in ways that tied the Americans down, demonstrated Japan's commitment playing an international role in creating all the commitments in Washington or around the region that made it harder ultimately for the United States. All of this was in the service of that larger set of national security interests. So if you take a prime minister who you're not clear what he believes in, and perhaps he isn't clear what he believes in, wants to listen, you have a party that's moving to the right, and then you have this powerful legacy and all of the forces that preceded him. And so in this world, that momentum matters, and the institutional capacity, bureaucracy matters a lot more. And one of the hallmarks, if you want to get into this, it's an interesting subject. One of the hallmarks, of course, of the Abe era was the centralization of power in the cabinet, the national security secretariat. It's because you had a prime minister with a vision, and he wanted to control the bureaucracy. And he had power over appointments. The cabinet had great power. The prime minister had great power over appointments throughout the bureaucracy, not just at the ministerial level, but in the deputies, but even below that. Well, over time, one of the things that you've seen is the actual movement away. And I've heard some of my bureaucratic friends in various ministries complain that they are once again free to do as they wish. They lack in the direction in the prime minister's office they have. So all of that means this is how the power sort of redistributes itself when a prime minister is maybe not, isn't he weak, but is not as committed, not as prepared to use his capital as he has. So those are the first three factors, internal factors. The fourth one, I would argue, is the role of the business law in Japan. And I see this overlapping a lot with the China discussion, because they are very, very similar. And this morning, I gave a talk to the US-Japan business that was coupling and de-risking resilience national security interest that accompany those processes, which basically becomes a question of how is it that we're going to engage with Japan. And again, it's interesting, you see, is on the political side, great skepticism and concern about Japan, and yet in the business community, you still see continuing engagement. Prior to COVID, the great number was 44% of Japanese growth. Pre-COVID was attributable to the Chinese market. The profits that Japanese companies took accounted for nearly half of all Japanese economic growth. That's diminished a bit. But if you compare the commitment of the Japanese business community as to say that with the Americans and Europeans, there's a far, far greater readiness and commitment, ongoing commitment to doing business in China, despite the costs, and they are high, than there are elsewhere in the world. So you've got, and it's an interesting contrast because within the government itself, within Jamito, within say foreign ministry, which is where I'm most familiar, there used to be very powerful China faction, the China Hada used to be called. They're gone. They've essentially been, they've shrunk it and almost vanished. They used to be equal power centers. The Director General for North American Affairs and the Director General for Chinese or Asian Affairs, which is essentially China Post, were almost equivalent in terms of their power within foreign ministry. Now the China Hada is gone, and North American Affairs is assumed much of that power. It's also been distributed somewhere elsewhere among allies and partners. But within the business community, that interest in China retains great vitality, considerable power. And so, I mean, China is today Japan's largest trading partner. Japan is China's third after the US and the ROK. It's the third largest investment destination for Japanese investment. There are over 31,000 bases of Japanese companies in China, and it is the first largest, location for foreign business headquarters for Japanese companies. At the same time, and as you can imagine, at a time of rising geopolitical competition and tensions between the United States or between the West and China risk is growing. Businesses are increasingly alert to the dangers of being exposed to that country. So, and I was just noticing, I think this was in the Nikkei yesterday, according to the Nikkei survey, 60%, more than 60% of Japanese business leaders expect the risks of operating in China to increase. Over the short term, however, 20.5% will expand their business in China. 75% will maintain the current level and 5% will reduce. Over the long term, 10% will increase business accounted for by PRC operations. 48.3% will stay, 77.5% will decrease, and 34% don't know what they're doing. I would suggest to you that those numbers are far, far higher in regard to the commitment to China than you will find among a similar survey of American and European companies. At this and this poses, of course, great dilemmas for these particular companies and for Japan. Obviously, at a time when the United States is increasingly skeptical of engagement with China, the idea somehow or other that its allies companies are doing business with the enemy, which is an inflammatory formulation, a slight exaggeration, but only slight. To do that is real problematic as far as the United States is concerned. And those companies are well aware of the difficulties that this poses. So, for example, in some other times of the day, I'll be wearing another cap as a business consultant. And when we talk to foreign companies, what you see them doing is trying to balance two very powerful sets of equities. The first, of course, is the access to the Chinese market, which is huge. Hundreds of millions of people and growing. Second largest economy in the world, a place where you need to do business and you need to be close to your customers if you're going to serve them well. And then there is great concern from the United States or from the West doing anything with the compromise, if you will, national security. You're either helping, again, develop companies that compete on the highest end, the frontiers of high technology, which is where they actually, or even actually assisting them in developing tools that would help their military in case of a conflict. So what you're seeing internally to balance these two sets of imperatives is the creation of firewalls internally. Because all these companies, for example, you name it, whether it's Toyota, whether it's big construction companies, whether it's semiconductor companies, what have you, what they're all doing is doing their very best to maintain operations in China and at the same time not somehow fall afoul of American regulations that would restrict that presence. So that's a very difficult balancing act. And it's one that they're all dealing with, if you will, on a daily basis. So let's see. That's 4 internal factors. Number 5, I'll just lump together and I'll call Big Japan. And that's as Professor Miyashita said, that's the title of my book that came out a few years ago, that argued that we are seeing the best Japan has to offer. That this is the apogee, if you will, of Japanese influence in the world. I hope that that theory is wrong, because you never like to see a country go into decline. But nevertheless, I think it's very, by the arguments that I make in the book, and I again urge you to buy it, because royalties go to that aforementioned college. But also because I think they're true, that there are powerful constraints against Japan, or internal constraints that ultimately mitigate against this broader presence in the world, and the achievement, if you will, of so many of Abe's, Prime Minister Abe's objectives of returning Japan to its position of power and greatness, of being one of the top 3 or 4 countries in the world. I would say, by the way, that the performance of the last few years, Japan has managed to maintain its status and standing. But I'm concerned that that isn't possible over time. And a lot of the reasons that Japan has managed to do so well is because the rest of the world has just made it look so good by comparison. And among the rest of the world, I would put high among the American confusion and craziness that is evident every day. So again, quickly, how on time? Always talking longer than I thought. Let me offer you just a couple of the structural factors that I'll highlight here and go into. First, of course, is demographic and deficit. National deficits. Japan is the largest indebted, has the largest debt of any developed country in the world, something 234 to 236% of GDP, depending on how you measure it. We've been told for decades that this is utterly unsustainable, yet it manages to be sustained every year. So it will, that balloon will stay in the air until suddenly the Japanese decide it's no longer sustainable. And far, far better economists than I will ever be, you can never know, suggest that there is no way of telling how long Japan can manage to keep its economy afloat. But equally important and contributing to the difficulties is the demographic decline. Since the 1970s, it's been clear that Japan was going to reach a peak and it was going to have an inverted pyramid where you would have the greatest society in the world with shrinking numbers of young people, lots of old people, and an inability necessarily to pay their pensions and support them through taxes and other forms of revenue. Japan, every year, right, usually around May is when I believe the statistics come out from various government sites that talk about Japan either having for the X year in a row the number of births being outdone by the number of deaths, or that net immigration is once again being overtaken by, or continues to be overshadowed by emigration. That the country is largely shrinking. So you've had a peak probably at 128 million a few years ago. It's shrinking by several 100,000 every year. The actual numbers are, if it continues on its current trajectory, I believe until 2060 or 2100, Japan will reach a population of 78 million, which is 2/3. The government several years ago under Prime Minister Abe said, we will hold the line at 100 million, which if you think about it is quite remarkable, because it said Japan, the government was prepared to concede essentially a quarter of its population, 28 million people, and that was going to be acceptable. Now, in my formulation of great powers in the world, if Japan were to manage that decline successfully, which it could, it would in fact be a great power, because it would demonstrate its ability to solve problems that every developed society is going to face. The problem is that I'm not seeing any indication, any readiness to make the hard choices, to shift the focus, if you will, of government policy, of thinking of ways to conceptualize power and the use of power in the international system domestically in ways that would allow Japan to demonstrate a new form of leadership and power. And in the absence of doing that, clinging to 20th century versions of strength, which is very much what Prime Minister Abe believed in, and where that momentum is taking the country. As long as that continues to be the case, I don't see Japan making that adjustment to the to society 5.0 and really addressing the problems that I think, that would demonstrate that credibility and that seriousness. Equally important are what I call psychological factors. There remains, and I ask particularly those of you, you young ones, for those of you that are Japanese, those of you that know Japanese, I assume everybody needs to know. Think about the nature, the psychology of your friend. I'm being abstract. Quite simply, most Japanese have a profound aversion to deep international engagement. There's a tendency to look at this country as we 100 million hearts beating with one, that is somehow distant from, not necessarily part of Asia, but is clearly in Asia. I argued, 20-something years ago, what I call Japan's Swiss option, which was to be, this little little haven of wealth and prosperity and stability and peace in the heart, and completely indifferent and unengaged in the rest of Asia's problems, as Switzerland is with Europe. It's an interesting theory. But I do think it reflects a belief among many Japanese about their proper place. And I think that there's this psychology, this aversion again to engagement, preference to stay out of the trouble of the region in the world because of all the troubles that creates by getting ensnared, complemented by an inwardness that focuses again on that looks in instead of out, that believes in comfort, that acknowledges the extraordinary accomplishments of this place. And for those of you that spend time in Tokyo, for an economy that has ostensibly been paralyzed, stagnant for 3 decades, entire parts of the city are being recreated every couple of years. It's amazing. And if you're like me, and you like to eat, you'll find that there are no more Michelin stars than any other city in the world. It's a great place to live. I wrote this book about Japanese decline, and then I moved back to Japan. That speaks to a certain faith about the lifestyle here, about what's offered. And what I'm not arguing is Japan should change. But what I'm arguing is Japan is very much a different country than it has been presented. And thus, I think all of the psychology, and in particular, to that last point that I was making, the belief that things here, for all of the statistical anomalies and all the problems that seem to exist, the fact is life ain't bad. And so there isn't a good reason to change. And while it's comfortable, I would argue that stasis, again, the continuing momentum in a certain direction, is not going to prepare this country for the really rich adjustments that are going to come in a world that is undergoing great, great change on so many different levels. And those, to me, the psychological factors are the most important ones that keep the internal factors that Prime Minister Kishida, his successor, any Japanese leader is going to have to face. And I would suggest that all of the contradictions that I just talked about, they're all going to get worse. Ambitions that Japan has, and even I think Kishida has. If you look at his performance at the G7, he liked what that particular role was. He was the focus of global attention, and he did a hell of a job. And so I think that his readiness to nurture that ambition, to continue to play that role, which he has pledged to do then and subsequently. And I think every Japanese prime minister sees the international stage as a way of burnishing their image. But all of those things require choices. They're going to require money, which Japan doesn't have a great deal of these days. Historically, we've talked about choices in societies and politicians that make between guns and butter, right? Do you support the economy with your funds, or do you support the military machine? Japan has historically, by virtue of a constitution and the decision to limit military spending to 1% of GDP, which just got kicked out the window this year. It's going to be double now, although there's both more and less to that decision than most people think. It's not between, for Japan, that choice is not between guns and butter. It's, I would argue, between guns and wheelchairs. It's between guns and dealing with the welfare state that's going to address the oldest population, greatest population in the world. But then when I started to think about it, what's been also one of the biggest priorities, supposedly, of Prime Minister Kishida talks about is childcare, right? So it's not only guns versus wheelchairs, it's guns versus wheelchairs versus strollers. I'm going to trademark that one because I've heard anyone say that. But I think that very much captures, these are the choices that he's going to have to make, and he's made no demonstration of a readiness to face it. right? And so the rhetoric continues to be traditional. On the one hand, we want to create, new capital society. We want to deal with the growing inequality, but we want to spend more money on childcare. We want to double our defense budget, and we're also not going to increase taxes. I have no clue how you reconcile all those forces. I don't think he does either. That's why, again, he refuses to make a hard decision and just keeps saying we'll deal with it. So that, in 30 minutes, were the internal factors. Now let me cover the external, which I've alluded to quickly, and I'll try to be relatively fast with it. The first, of course, is an uncertain international environment. And you're all aware of this. You start with Ukraine. What Ukraine has demanded is that all of the talk about revisions, the idea that countries can actually roll across the borders of other countries, invade, sovereign states, redraw, revise international borders, is not just, the work of academics. Isn't just abstract thought. It is a reality. Defense and deterrence is real. And so we've got to address that. And countries, and I think, this is not an abstraction. What we're also discovering, I think, is that the institutions of the international order are being tested and by and large being found to fail. The United Nations has been toothless and voiceless in so much of what's happening. And it doesn't have to just be Ukraine, it could also be dealing with Can we deal with some, almost pick your crisis and show me your role with the United Nations. The G20 continues to be and puts out chairman statements because you're really almost unable to muster a consensus behind a group statement, mostly because of the Ukraine crisis. And that was ostensibly created in the aftermath of the global financial crisis to be a new mechanism for global economic governance. Doesn't seem to do much there. The WTO, the apex economic organization for world trade, has been crippled because of the United States obstinacy, its refusal to appoint new judges to the appellate board, such that there is no way to enforce its judgments. So the key instruments of economic order I want to suggest in global economic order or global order are all being weakened at a time of great stress, great strain. There is the rise of alternatives. There's the BRICS grouping, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which decided its last summit to take in 6 new members. I'm frankly not real concerned about that, given the way, given which 6 members those are and the internal fissures within the BRICS as an organization. But nevertheless, you're starting to see the creation of another multilateral forum that ostensibly will speak for more than just the 7 nations of the G7, which is presumed to be the global political leadership. You see China being extremely aggressive with its creation of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative. Xi Jinping has a desire to shape international relations in ways that far greater favor Chinese preferences and Chinese interests. Now, whether he succeeds in that is another question, but nevertheless, what you see is a design. So what it suggests again to me are that the instruments of international order are under stress. And I think at the same time, let's give again Prime Minister Kishida great credit for turning the G7, which I thought had just become a photo op, into an actual functional organization. That the Hiroshima meeting was quite successful. It demonstrated that this organization, at least in theory, is able to produce serious outcomes. It serves as a rallying point for defense of Ukraine, defense of the idea that orders of sacrosanct, that the security is indivisible. I mean, there's something to that. We'll see how far it goes. But I don't think, at least he's demonstrated that that institution is no longer, one that's deserving of being abandoned yet. Japan has pushed the CPTPP, and I think, again, one of Prime Minister Abe's great accomplishments is not giving up on the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the Americans pulled out. Great thing that kept it going. I was in a meeting this morning, again, that meeting, and they put together a statement, and like the third line on the third bullet is, we still hope the Americans will return to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it's just, every time I hear a Japanese diplomat talk about economic relations, that's one of the talking points. It's just shit fantasy. I don't see any chance in the way it's going. But Japan's commitment to the idea and to the institution itself, I think, are really quite impressive. Similarly, you've got the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that is an attempt to create a larger set of economic relations. We've also got the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. So all these strike me as being institutions that are worthy of mention and worthy of support, but all attest, if you will, to a fracturing of the consensus about global order, and you see an international system that is very much in flux. And so that's one of the important countercurrents the Japanese foreign policy has to face. Now I'm going to turn real quickly to the big headlines for the big countries. So first is the United States. I mean, I think all of them know the stories I will tell, which is Japan is concerned about the repeal of America First. Whether Donald Trump is either the presidential nominee or get the president again, almost is irrelevant. I think what we've seen in the Republican Party is the rise of an America First sort of Trumpist, for short of, although I'm not sure what Trump is anymore. You've got a real commitment to turning our back, collecting back on the institutions of global order that the United States built in the aftermath of World War II. Whether it's trade, whether it's political, it is a greater inclination to be unilateral and isolationist than has been the case in the past. President Biden, I think, represents all that is best of American multilateralism and foreign policy, that commitment to those longstanding pillars of engagement. However, the point is he doesn't speak for the country. I mean, as a president, yes, but the degree to which that represents the consensus of belief regarding foreign policy is no longer true. And that troubles me a great deal. It's particularly true when it comes to trade relations and economic presence. Security question. There is at one moment a demand for the greater role and contribution on the part of our allies and partners, which manifested precisely in Japan's readiness to double its defense budget. You have a confluence of what the conservatives want, what the Americans are demanding, and at the same time, however, the Americans are still somewhat reluctant, if you will, to loosen our grip on our allies and partners. We've historically maintained relationships where we were the senior partner, whether it was even in NATO, but even certainly in the bilateral relationships that define the Asia Pacific. Now we want more from those partners, and yet we are less or not as willing to sort of go light in our touching ways to give those partners agency. And the tensions are still defining the way that our alliances are shifting, evolving in this new international era. Japan is trying to find its place in that evolution, trying to carve out a space for Japan, both as an actor within the alliance and within the larger multilateral relations, and even sometimes outside of them. And then, of course, there is the paralysis, the clownishness. Adjectives defy me as what political behavior in Washington in the last couple of weeks, last couple of years. It's very hard to say, how you trust an ally, which seems to be just so incapable of organizing its political system and, if you will, acting in a coherent and serious manner. China, we've kind of alluded to that, but China has become far more assertive, far more capable. It is returning to, I think, it certainly sees itself reasserting its role as the regional hegemon, as being not only a regional hegemon, but a global power over time. And as part of that, of course, is a tangled history with Japan. There is invasion, not only in the Pacific War period, but even before that, a competition between who is the rightful leader of the region. At the same time, China is experiencing currently great economic weakness. And we're once again debating whether or not the greatest challenge to the international system is a weak China or a strong China. And finally, you have all of this overlaid by the domestic political dynamic. Xi Jinping reasserts the power of a great man, reasserts the cult of the leader in ways that compound the fractures in society and create even greater potential instabilities in China. All of this gives Japan a challenge as it tries to, again, address the region, tries to find its role, find its partners, figure out how and who it can work with as it tries to deal with the challenges that the Prime Minister faces. All U.S. allies and partners in the region, which is my friend, have similar kind of outlooks and are addressing the same set of challenges, responding the same way. So as I said, what they're trying to do, of course, is deal with American unilateralism, American exceptionalism, American inconsistency, and at the same time, they're worried very much about China's division, China's aggressiveness, its readiness to use coercion. So it's concerned also then about the economic relationships it has with China. It's concerned about its security relationship and then worried about its security partner being very unreliable. Into this place, Japan inserts itself, as if you will, as another manager of regional relations, something that is trying to forge, the ties between, what used to be called the spokes of the hub. The United States is the center, and the various allies are on the outside. You see them with the RAA, with Australia, the Reciprocal Access Agreement, which allows cooperation with the Australian military. Similar deal with the Brits. You see negotiations with the Filipinos, and you see similar, I believe, they're just beginning to talk with the Germans. I just read the other day. You also have increasing aid and assistance in changing the rules about ODA and security assistance to countries in the region, so that Japan is playing a much bigger role in regional security affairs. All of this is intended, if you will, to thicken the weave of relations in ways that dampen down instability, create ties, and, if you will, eliminate the spaces in which instability can arise. Japan's trying to play a key role in all of that. At the same time, and as one countervailing consideration, one of the things that I hear in conversations across the region, I was just in Thailand last week, and the people I was talking to were telling me, Japan is the great understated power in Southeast Asia, especially in Thailand, that Japan has made so many investments, provided so much foreign aid, and it never talks about it. It has great influence that it never chooses to use. Now, I've had people tell me that the reason Japan has great influence is because it's never tried to use it. And once it does, it just becomes any other middle and outside power. And in fact, one of the things that you see as Japan talks increasingly about a geopolitical struggle with China, between China and the West, we worry about a free and open Indo-Pacific. Japan speaks about that in very neutral terms, but a lot of the countries in the region see it as a geopolitical play, and see Japan, which has historically been viewed as one of the most neutral and trusted outside parties of the region, somehow separate from the competition between Washington and China for influence. As Japan pushes its free and open Indo-Pacific, it's seen as assuming a geopolitical role, as having, if you will, a dog in the fight on scale in ways that deprive it of that neutrality, which isn't so important. It's the way it's seen in the past. Finally, I have to mention, and I promise my last point, South Korea. I have to mention because A, I wrote a book on the subject. B, you can buy that too. B, because it's so damn important. South Korea is really, in so many ways, you'd expect South Korea to be natural partners. Democracies, their market economies, they're roughly countries with similar size, certainly similar geography, should be addressing the same sets of issues, should be presenting a united front to the region and the world. Certainly, if you talk to people in the various military and security establishments, they tell you that our security interests are absolutely interrelated. It is, as one operator told me, a single operational theater. You can't defend Japan without South Korea and vice versa. And yet, you managed to have the relationship has been, put it mildly, troubled. There's a great historic opportunity with the assumption of power of President Yoon. And Japan has moved, but I think most people that, from my perspective, that do my work, and particularly from the US side, would suggest that Tokyo has been a bit slow. It has not seized the moment, has not really helped you overcome some of the domestic political opposition that you face. And again, this universal perception of reluctance is also not helping you as well. He's seen as going too far. It's undermining some of his position, quite frankly, as in South Korean politics are unbelievably pendulum like, deeply, deeply divided. Prime ministers are elected usually with relatively high popularity, and then just goes down continually. And if they manage to survive their 5-year term, by the time they're out, everybody's glad that they're gone. And the pendulum typically swings to the other side. If that is the case, what we're going to have is a very progressive president return to South Korea. So, in which case, all of the agreements, all of the progress made over the last couple of years is all going to be a threat. So the trick is now going to be to lock in as much as possible. I'm very honest, I have no idea. I don't know how you can insulate these deals from political and public pressures. But you've got to do as much as you can. So hopefully, when that pendulum swings again, that the relationship will survive and that Japan's interest will be secured. But that requires, again, I think, far more energy and effort than Japan has put into this, and which again I think is probably a good concluding remark to suggest how Kishida, the Prime Minister himself, probably needs to invest more, have a firmer vision of what he wants to do, and then spend some political capital. Okay, There you go.
Okay, thank you, Brad, for your talk. This session was initially scheduled from 3 to 4, and I decided to prolong it to 4:30 because 1 hour is just too short, and I was glad that I did that because we heard a lot of interesting stories, analysis from Professor Glosserman. And I know many of you have some questions to ask, but let me just start by myself.
Nice.
Okay, I just want to ask one question. You mentioned about Prime Minister Kishida and he's hosting summit meeting in Hiroshima this year. And you said, that summit meeting was quite successful and he maybe shown what there. I basically agree. At the same time, I have a very uneasy feeling about having a summit in Hiroshima. And of course, that's Prime Minister Kishida's constituency, so he would have to, do it. But at the same time, he strongly emphasized Japan as a peaceful nation. Japan being the only country where the atom bombs were dropped on, and many Japanese learn about this history throughout high school, junior high, even elementary schools. And I think Hiroshima and Nagasaki are the iconic cities where policymakers can sometimes use or abuse to unite the nation, the appeal of Japan's pacifism. But at the same time, as you mentioned, Japan is under greater pressure to do more on defense and security issues. For example, support for Ukraine in its war against Russia. Japan has been reluctant to send, for example, weapons. It has so far sent helmets, bulletproof jackets, transportation vehicles. In contrast, countries like Germany, which initially was quite reluctant to send weapons, but now it's sending quite lethal weapons and attacks. Do you think that this pacifism and the Japanese emphasis on Hiroshima, which portrays Japanese as main victims of World War II, pose a great constraint on Japan, playing a larger role in the global security issues? Certainly in Asia, but also beyond Asia and places like Europe or the Middle East. What's your opinion about this?
It's a great question, and there's no easy answer. But I think the key word is constraint. And so the answer is, Japan's pacifism. Does the Constitution act as a constraint on Japanese behavior? I think no. Honestly, Japan's politicians and bureaucrats have been really good at ignoring what had been limits created by the Constitution when they wanted to ignore them. And I think they use those when it does, they don't want to do something. They don't want to make a hard choice. They say constitutional rights. And I mean, it's wild. It's politically expedient. Let's start with that. Secondly, though, I honestly think that having this what that has forced Japan to do this was think about security conceptually differently in the United States. Right? When you've got the largest military in human history, when you spend more money on your military than every other country in the world combined, when you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So when you've got that extraordinary military instrument, your inclination is, let's use it. And when Japan doesn't, it means that it has to be more creative about problem solving. And that's one of the things that I've inculcated in the 30 years that I've started living breathe is precisely the fact that to appreciate this larger sense of defense and deterrence and security that the Japanese have been so instrumental in promoting around the world, precisely because of the limitations of their own diplomatic toolbox. And by itself, it doesn't work. In the face of an aggressive power like Vladimir Putin's Russia, or perhaps Xi Jinping's China, we don't know that. All that goodwill, those good intentions don't count for anything. You need aircraft carriers and you need missiles. But I think you should be willing to use and have a very, very diverse set of instruments to use instead. And the Japanese, I think, the point that I'm making about Japan's extraordinary goodwill in the region is a function of the fact that Japan said at one point, well, our fates are all tied economically. And we recognize that the best way to keep peace is to make people rich and fat and happy. So we'll help them get rich. And they'll get fat and happy on their own. And you need those diverse perspectives. And as much as I think a world free of nuclear weapons is both a wonderful idea and absolutely silly, I like having people make that case with passion and logic. And there is a way to make that because it maintains a perspective and a range of opinions to address these problems. If you take away the disarmament group, discussion about problem solving, the way to address security issues goes from being this long to this long. Because all the disarmament people take away that side of the thing. I like having the center of gravity that moves. It doesn't mean it's unrealistic. It just means that we have to be more creative and the opportunity to be more creative about problem solving. So, to the degree that the Constitution prevents Japan from doing things, first of all, the Constitution has never been a suicide pact. And so every time there's been an important security policy decision, the Constitution has been subtly pushed to the side. But nevertheless, I think that Japan uses it's forced to do more with what it has. And I think Japan is better for it than region is better for it. And I would, in some ways I wish, the United States would sometimes be a little more open-minded about, a little less lazy, if you will. Not to say, as I just say that, it sounds, I want to be careful because I don't want to suggest that we are warmongers or that we are too quick to use the military tool because there's an extraordinary human cost associated with that. But I think we would do well to think more broadly. Having Japan be limited, I think, is a good thing.
Great, thank you for that comment. All right, let's open the floor for free discussion. One, please.
Yes, I can so agree.
And who are you?
Yeah, food, corn. My name is corn. Graduate student. I'm responsible for studying. And also a little bit of report. So to continue the theme of security and the theme of factoring the current. I want to ask what is the most urgent internal and external countercurrent the Kishida administration had to face to make the new overseas security system OSA more than a mere extension of the ODA, which means anything beyond maritime domain awareness and non-nuclear.
Man, that's a technical question. Does everybody know what he was talking about? Right, OSA, ODA, official security assistance. Japan has historically been unable to provide in its security assistance or its assistance to regional countries anything that theoretically could be used for military purposes. You can provide both, for example, for Coast Guard, that's for law enforcement. You couldn't give them guns, they could shoot at other people. That's military security stuff. They've just amended they've opened a new office in cabinet, actually. The Office of Security Assistance, which now allows them to send out materials that are more, strictly speaking, capable of being used in the military, rather than expanding the universe of options because of a perceived need to build capacity. Now, it is a need to build capacity in the United States. And this is a big step. On the one hand, there aren't really a lot of obstacles other than just the readiness of these countries, of Japan, to work with these countries to identify their needs. It may well be that I mean, it's hard to see where, as I was coming up with like, sorry. Take a breath. It's hard to see where the problems are, in the sense that what Japan is going to offer will usually be fairly affordable and fairly usable. And so the countries would, I would think, be prepared to accept it. Also, because it's not going to be high level equipment, Japan should be prepared to provide it. So I don't anticipate a great deal of difficulty in using this particular instrument in ways that would maximize both the benefit to Japan and the benefit to the citizens. I mean, it just becomes a question of whether it gets the staffing and the attention and the budget. And again, so then that just boils down to the same old. They can get the money that they need to provide the stuff. No, I don't see this as being a huge shift. Not a huge shift. I don't think so. It's contrary.
Thank you. Thanks. Any other? Yes.
I'm Sipan, third year undergraduate from IR. The question is more of, do you think the foreign policy of Japan will change if Kishida decides or Kishida is forced to take to have a coalition with other parties?
Interesting question. I mean, so the question becomes, Kome has been a good constraint, but at the same time, Kome responds. I think Kome represents in many ways the center of gravity in Japanese society, even though they, the numbers of parliamentarians and the number of votes that they get. I think an expression of social preferences, Kome is pretty close to this, having studied on the calls. Ishin is more right, obviously, but I don't see necessarily Ishin as having national presence in ways that the LDP would be particularly comfortable with. I would think that over time, what happens is that the LDP will just poach some of the more popular Ishin members. I wish it has historically done in the past. So the constraints on political decision-making in Japan are not a function of coalition. It's a function of the center of gravity of the Japanese party and sets of constraints that are outside the political system. They matter somewhat to Kishida, but they're not determined. That's the way I would look at it.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hello, my name is my question is, you mentioned domestically, Kishida had a democratic facilitating type of leadership amongst the LDP. She did consider them in a favorable light with the public, but there's a consensus that says otherwise, backed by recent articles. On the other hand, he's like as you mentioned, received an amicable reception on the local stage at the G7. So do you think this is an intentional strategic decision? Like you said, Japan needs to be seen on the world stage, and they need that obviously could lead them to like growth.
Mhm.
So, and
What is an intentional decision? Is this an intentional decision? What?
yes, like you think Kishida like planned this? Like you mentioned him like he's riding the wave, but playing devil's advocate, I saw
No devil's advocate here. I mean, I think Kishida is one who likes being prime minister. I mean, the stories that I was told was that Kishida was supposed to have been Abe's choice as a successor before he left office in 2019. He was his choice, and he was given a task within the LDP and botched it. And that cost him his support within the party, and that's why Suga became the PM when Abe stepped down. There wasn't a suitable replacement. He was seen as the best placeholder. And then Kishida managed to sort of fix his prior mistakes, ease over some of the problems he had with other leading Jumito figures. He managed to secure Abe's support again, and then he came back. But he's his problems, his popularity, I think, reflect scandals. Obviously, his son not being the political asset. Gosh, I'm forgetting right now. But it's also just been an inability on his part to make hard decisions. I think the politicians, the public understand when they're being played. And so they're not prepared to reward him with political support when he's not doing anything really to earn it. Come on, it's gotta be a harder one than that.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Jesslyn. I'm a associate student in my house. My question is, I focus on the point that the birth rate in Japan is declining, and you said it would be a show of great problem solving to the other nations if they actually solve this problem. I want to ask, like, what do you think is the best way for the government to actually solve this problem, and how would they involve their people, like actually like play a role in this?
Okay, first let's be clear about what I said. I didn't, by solving the problem, I don't think Japan necessarily needs to keep its population at the level it's at. I mean, by solve the problem, what I meant was figure out a way for Japan to adjust to a new reality of a shrinking population, of an aging population, in ways so that Japan helps manage the transition demographically. Also, that it makes the transition to a digital era, and then also into a sustainable green, we call it GX and DX, right? Digital transformation and green transformation. For Japan to be able to successfully turn this society into one that's populated and you know, that's run with smart cities, that is more accommodating of the needs of an elderly population, and yet meets all the needs of the citizens. For it to do that, that is the solution that I'm talking about. To make this transition away from a 21st century or 20th century notion of power, consumerism, et cetera, in the 21st century. And a lot of blanks need to be filled. It's not necessarily solve the problem in ways that allow the population to stay at its current levels. But the biggest issue, I think, that Japan needs to face more than anything else, is treating its women better, for God's sake, giving women more choices in their lives and in their work, so that they don't feel trapped, that they, you know, that they're ready to start, you know, to get married, to have families, and not feel as though the entire once they do that, their lives are over. That all in, and listen, if you want to be a mother and a housewife and stay at home, that's fine, as long as that's your choice. But that shouldn't be what you're forced to do by sexual. That Japan, you know, it needs to unleash the productivity of its women. It needs to unleash the productivity of its elder population, which is largely unappreciated. And so, give women choices. Right? Give them childcare. You know, get men to take paternity leave. Do something that offers women better lives. And in so doing, hopefully, that unleashes extraordinary productivity in society. Now, yeah, we've talked to the about that. But they haven't been doing it for, I mean, the first studies that identified Japan's future demographic trajectory and looming demographic crisis occurred in 1970, right? That was 50 years ago. And it took me, when I first started working on this problem about 50 years ago, I started writing stuff about that. And it occurred to me, even to me, and I'm not the smartest guy in the room, that, you know, not addressing a problem is a way of dealing with the problem. It tells you don't have the courage, you don't have the readiness to make a decision. Not making a decision is a decision, right? The Japanese failure to acknowledge this when the causes was very clear, I think speaks to the nature of the conservatism, small c conservatism in Japan. It's a country that likes things the way they are. Doesn't necessarily make this. So, you know, to address that, you unleash the productivity of the 50% of the population, essentially, feels as though it doesn't have the choice. That's the reason. But I mean, the real question is thinking differently about power. I mean, the way power is exercised, thinking differently about society, taking aim at so many of the institutions, the vested interests of society and the economy, because that they're going to be transitioned.
I was wondering if the outside pressures are a little bit different to shape that reaction, but I'm not asking compared to countries. What I actually want to ask about is you've mentioned Japan. Imagining this as a kind of bell curve of influence on the international stage, so whatever. Where would you put a peak US and peak China, and how much of a role would you say like perceptions of that kind of stuff play when it comes to foreign policy? You say that maybe you can ride the waves because you're trying to see what actually happens on the world stage before you can commit to major.
Yeah, except when you're riding the wave, it's pretty hard to get out of or to get off of. So I've lived in Hawaii, so it's pretty tough, man. When you're on top of it. It's a really good question. Let me also just say that Germany has been. I've always been interested in the fact, for example, as Germany came out of its shell in the 90s, who was leading that charge? The Greens. Joschka Fischer, et cetera, which was the Greens were these really real liberal, very much, very left progressive groups. And yet they were the ones that acknowledged, as Prime Minister, interesting enough, just as Prime Minister Koizumi did 10 years later, we have benefited from an international system that has supported us. We need to support it. And thus, I think what you see in Germany and in the more thinking elements of the conservative or even the progressive movement in this country that's inclined against active intervention is an awareness of history and an understanding that you just don't go into this without an acknowledgement of the many difficulties that you could face. And I think that balancing of equities is really important. And having a sense of history, and it's hard to know which lessons of history to draw and to learn from. It's really tough, but it's far better that we have some sense of history than we have not. And so I think Germany needs to be applauded for that, as do parts of the left in Japan. On the other hand, the sense again of responsibility, the motivating factor for engagement is not aggrandizement. It was always been the idea of paying back, right? And because the Spider-Man was that great philosopher and theorist of international relations. With great power comes great responsibility, right? And so it's natural or it's unnatural. The countries like Germany and Japan would love to stay out of international security management. It's the way that they have. So this is a reversion, I think, to these other questions. So that was a long-winded answer to the question you didn't ask. Peak Japan and perceptions. I mean, I have to believe that the madness in the United States is temporary. Yeah, I hope so. And that the bubble will burst, the fever will pass, and we will return to some normalcy. I don't know if that's going to be in the 2024 election, but maybe 2028. But we have capacity for correction in ways that, unfortunately, the libertarianism that marks American society creates great move and great freedom for excess and bad behavior. Let's hope that some sanity will reassert itself. I mean, I see enough of it to think that it's a minority of a minority, that it's really over the edge. They can do a lot of damage when they've got the firepower that they've got. As for China, China's a much bigger, much more fractious country that has, unfortunately, less of a record, right, of being, it either managed very powerfully as strongman that holds the country together using all the instruments of the state, or extrajudicial, for example, in the Cultural Revolution, or it seems to be on the verge of chaos. And it is the fear precisely of chaos that propels so many people to back the strongman. So there's less, I guess there's less of a middle ground. We just haven't seen it. From the Deng Xiaoping reform era until, say, Xi Jinping's successes, say what, 1976 to 2016, I mean, that's a rough period, 40 years. Out of how many thousand years of civilization? That's not encouraging. So I would be, I have less, and you would argue too that the authoritarian political system in China is more brittle than that of the United States, and that may just be projection on my part. Hope not. But nevertheless, so I think there's less reason to be as optimistic about China. But do not count China out. I think that one thing that we do way too quickly in the West is project our prejudices on the Chinese. And we see them through the prism of wish casting rather than necessarily through the reality of China, which is a country with extraordinary resources, with a great capacity to do things. We are very quick across the board to denigrate and reduce Chinese accomplishments. And they're real. And we may not like them, but we've got to acknowledge what China does, what it can do. And the greatest challenge that we face, to be honest, is accepting. Give me a minute to riff. Sure. I teach a class in Europe every year. I go to Austria and I teach for a week. And it's great. I get to yell at students for one entire week for like 8 hours a day. And I have to do all this stuff, for literally, and they don't know anything about Asia for the most part. So nobody questions me. Nobody doesn't really. But the world that you guys live in is a world undergoing sort of tectonic shift, right? And the course was originally called Why Asia Matters. And now I call it Understanding Contemporary Asia. And I literally cover the entire region, everything, over the course of 5 days. What we see is that the world order that was, and what's undergirding all of these, the world order that the United States, its allies and partners created in 1945 worked for 50 years. And it doesn't work anymore because of the rise of power from a global community, wealth and power centered on a transatlantic community dominated by the United States and Asia and Europe, to a trilateral order in which Asia is rival, not just China, but Asia. And unfortunately, instruments of power, the institutions of power, the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, you name it, have not changed in ways that reflect the wealth and, in theory, capacity of this rising whole. And so the question that we have in the United States is understanding, and the West, sorry, is understanding how is it that we accommodate the rise of the West. And the easy analogy is that the United States said, okay, where the West said, we have a dinner party, and we will now invite China to the table. You can join our dinner party. China said, thank you very much, but we're not just interested in being guests at your dinner party. We would like to not only get to decide who gets to come, but what's on the menu and what the table looks like. We're not here because of what you've given us. Where is it that we draw a line, that we accommodate the legitimate interests of not only China, but Russia, which actually would be pretty well represented. Saudi Arabia, the other BRICS countries, or other countries with rising interests, India in particular, Brazil, Indonesia. how do we accommodate those countries and their interests in ways that legitimately account for their diverging interests, their cultures, their societies, their political preferences, their values that may differ from ours, right? What is the acceptable movement of the lines at which we, how we run the world? And where do we draw a line and say, we will not go beyond this? At what point is the demand that a government wants to make about revising rules of international law, for example, about human rights, most particularly about the balance of power between the individual and the state? At what point do we say, no, that one we're going to fight for? And we don't have that answer, but that's the answer. That's the one that all you guys have to face. That's the world that you're inheriting. It's one that's in transition. We've not figured out where we draw the lines. But there are legitimate movements to be made. I can't tell you what they are, but I know that the way that the world exists today is not good enough. That's what, so much of this conversation. Sorry, that's one of my favorite little hobby horses, but how we adjust to the rise of the rest is the great unanswered question, and it's where all the fault lines in international politics lie.
I think we can take one more question, and that would be it. Yes, someone in the back. Yes, please.
Quick question. Okay.
My name is Chiquita. I'm a third year IR student here at TIU. And my question would be, so if we're looking at the other end of the spectrum of the demographic crisis we have to use, but the youth in Japan, it's known that they're kind of politically apathetic. Do you think this might be also a problem moving forward, or do you think this is not that big of a problem to Japan since it has been sustaining like this for a long time? Thank you.
And you have a question?
I'm not a small business and research student in operations. And I'm just listening to all these support this nutrition because basic women in society, and basically I was really nice to go about the organization of the government and it's only the focuses on Kishida and only how their popularity or skills are relying.
Two easy questions, really. Anybody else got one we can pile on? Come on. No. Jeff, you don't want to say anything nasty to me?
No, later.
Okay, so let's start with feminization. Yes, Kishida gets it like every other Japanese politician has gotten. Is he prepared to do something about it? No. So you got 5 cabinet ministers. Let's see when the scandal strikes who gets thrown out quickly. And we had, of course, no vice ministers or deputy ministers, no women in those photographs. Interesting. There have been numerous appeals and claims that we have to increase representation on boards to 30%, number of women politicians to whatever the percentage. None of those have ever been did. Put some teeth in the regulations, make some punishments and some penalties. Then I'll believe it's serious. I don't think, again, this is another one of those questions where you have vested interest. You bring a woman into an office, and that means, sorry, a man has to go out, the former occupant. And that guy has vested interest. So let's see when you actually prepare to tackle that and make those adjustments. Then I believe you. And by the way, all of the studies show that one woman in a position or one element of diversity, if you've got, if you're looking for color, if you're looking for gender, putting one person in that position doesn't do it. You need a third. It's the only way to bring about substantive and enduring change, to bring in different viewpoints and to get the benefits of this. So real quickly to apathy. No, apathy is not good. Apathy is bad. Please, young people need to be involved because you guys see the world differently. And frankly, the world works differently. The way you do it, the way you see it, the way you do things, the way I do things. Phones and doodads and how you spend your time and leisure, all of this is a different reflection of how we prioritize and how we engage. And old people do it the old ways, and you guys do it new ways, and make your preferences heard so that the world better reflects, the way you wish to get some things done, what your priorities are. Now, mind you, it would be helpful if you guys got smarter and did, there's nothing worse than really dumb people telling you how the world should work. So I would appreciate it very much if you got educated, if you listen to your professors, you bought my books, if you, do all the things that make you smarter and better and more engaged citizens, and then act on that in ways that reflect your priorities, the things that you want and like, hopefully, make it, in a better place. Quit leaving all the decision making to old people. You know what they want. They want things to stay exactly as they are. If you think that things are okay the way they are, then don't get smart. Don't get involved. If you want to see some changes, get involved. Jeez.
We conclude the conversation. Thank you so much.